Joining us now is Jeffrey Stacey, who is a national security consultant and a former U.S. State Department official under the Obama administration, and by Ali Demirdas, who was a Fulbright scholar before he earning a PhD in political science from the University of South Carolina. Gentlemen, good to have you here. What wonderful weather we're having here, and hopefully this can actually be continued, this atmosphere in the White House. Jeffrey, let me start with you. The U.S. president, when he was speaking with members of the press, he said that he and President Erdogan are good friends. Obviously, there's a good rapport. There is some camaraderie here. Yes. But this cordial, this friendly relationship can't be said the same about other branches of government, namely the legislative branch. Right. We know what's going on there. What does it say about sort of American foreign policy when you have a discord here?
It's a huge problem. We're not accustomed to this. This is brand new territory. We really haven't been anywhere like this in many, many decades. In fact, probably even longer. We've not seen a president like this who is as unpredictable as he is, who's as controversial as he is. And in essence, it was ripe territory of the exact president, someone like President Erdogan would want to get his way. My big boss would not have gone along with a joint plan for northern Syria such as has ensued. So you've got to hand it, in a way, to Turkey. They took advantage
So you're saying that if this would have happened under the Obama administration, they wouldn't have given a green light for Turkey to go in?
Absolutely not.
Okay, and Ali, I want to bring you in, sort of maybe follow up on what Jeffrey had to say. Very different sort of approaches when you compare the Obama administration and Trump administration. How does this work in favor of Turkey, or does it?
In order to understand how Trump conducts foreign policy, we need to understand how he sees the world. He is a businessman before anything, so he wants to resolve the world affairs through the lens of businessmen, and that's how he has approached to Turkish-American relations so far.
But can he do that by himself?
Of course not. He has been under tremendous pressure at home, particularly the Congress and the Pentagon actually have been pressing Trump to conduct American foreign policy the way that they want. So he is trying to strike a balance between Turkey and Congress.
President Trump said that he wasn't sort of watching the impeachment hearings, which actually goes public today. Right. But also, we know that there are a group of influential Republican senators that have also been invited to the White House. We talked about sort of the disconnect between Congress and the executive branch, but could this be an attempt to sort of clear the air?
It could be. It's a surprise, frankly, because Congress is entirely on a different page from the president on this, and has been for some time. It was dramatic for the House and the Senate to take these steps. Strong voices of criticism, even from an ally like Lindsey Graham, were really not quite expected. But then they didn't expect Donald Trump to green light this operation in northern Syria. That is at the core of all the opposition in the rest of the branches of government, especially.
But the White House would say that they actually never not do that in terms of giving a green light to Turkey.
They've claimed that, but the evidence seems contrary. In fact, most of us have an understanding that it was a shared agreement between Russia, Turkey, and the U.S. In fact, President Putin has been in touch with both leaders prior to. We just saw the Sochi meeting with President Erdogan as well, related to exactly this issue. And so it really has all the hallmarks. In fact, I would bet anything that it was agreed in advance by all three. And in essence, it was especially kind of botched here, because of course Trump would have been getting advice that if you do this, you're going to get basically political hell. And that's what he's gotten. So for President Erdogan to come here now is in a way surprising, because he knows he's coming into a hostile territory, also because of how the allegations of his bodyguards and past visits here in Washington, D.C. have gotten the mayor of Washington and residents here a little bothered. So hopefully he's coming with some sort of peace branch or a gesture that could align things, and especially with the Republican senators there, that may be a sign that they've actually prepared something that will surprise us a little bit and help the relationship back on an even keel.
Ali, just a second, just in terms of the Kurdish protesters, we saw this in the previous visit of President Erdogan back in 2017. But even as we were preparing to go on air, one of my colleagues, Tuna Shanla from our sister network, TRT Haber, the news channel, was provoked, was attacked by some of these sympathizers. So you do have to look at it from that perspective as well. Yes, you do have a right to peacefully protest, but when it comes to bringing to action, especially when a head of state, a leader of a country is coming, there needs to be some sort of security, some sort of protection involved. All right.
Going back to Jeffrey's remarks about we need to clearly understand what happened on October 9th before the Operation Peace Spring. Turkey had been signaling strongly that it was going to conduct this incursion, and Trump didn't want the American soldiers and the Turkish soldiers clash. So he, having seen that the Turks had been resolved to do that, he withdrew the American troops. And we need to understand that there was a Turkish resolution for the Operation Peace Spring, and Trump understood that it was going to happen anyways, so he withdrew the troops for two NATO allies not to clash.
Okay, so, but President Trump, in the remarks that he made to the press just moments ago, said that, you know, the U.S. have left troops in Syria only to secure the oil. In many months, in past months, we've seen sort of a seesaw. You know, we're withdrawing, ISIS or Daesh has been defeated, now we're back in. I think this has gone back and forth 3 times. Now the official stance is that the U.S. is there to sort of protect the oil fields from Daesh. Is that it?
It's really what I call the third non-withdrawal withdrawal.
Okay.
I mean, we're really playing with optics here. And, you know, images released to the media of American military vehicles on the move. But in fact, the number of troops and especially the equipment, mechanized equipment, has actually increased, not decreased. The administration is not actually being truthful with the American people about this. And it's partly the Department of Defense's, in a way, impressive diplomacy inside our own administration, with Trump having made a very clear decision that led to the events, because, as my colleague just pointed out, President Erdogan was very clear about what was going to take place. So you've actually seen an adroit move by our military leadership to finally persuade Trump not to entirely leave. And you've got an incredible scramble there, right? Because it's more than just the oil. It's ISIS operations. It's now 3 different forces, possibly 5, coming into contact with ISIS prisoners. And we've already know that a few hundred were released in the course of the fighting. So that is something that really the onus is on President Erdogan today to make sure that Turkey is fully in cooperation and actually going after Daesh and making sure that they're also not targeting sites where Kurds are still holding large amounts of ISIS prisoners.
I think you covered a lot, but I think before you came on, we had Hamdi Rifai on about an hour ago, and he was saying that the U.S. presence in northern Syria was actually a good thing in terms of protecting the oil fields. Therefore, they could actually sort of supervise or control that the YPG wouldn't be actually selling any oil to the Assad regime, which would be in violation of sanctions. Is that?
But there's a contradiction on the ground. One would understand that, okay, American troops are deployed around Deir ez-Zor or Kamishla area where there's oil, but the American troops have been redeployed to Ain al-Arab, which is called Kobani. There's no oil there. So the recent redeployment of American troops along the Turkish-Syria border basically clearly reveals the dysfunctionality within the government. It is as if Trump really wants to pull the troops out of Syria, but there is a force within the Pentagon, especially the CENTCOM. The Pentagon wants to stay there by any means necessary. So there's a tit for tat going on in the government in Washington between Donald Trump and the Pentagon.
Part of it relates to the operation to get al-Baghdadi. That was, and the Turks were helpful with this too, but it was primarily Kurdish intelligence that led to his elimination. And so you've got a situation where we've got an entirely re-scrambled chessboard here. It is dramatically different from
One that
4
changes
articles
almost every
I
week.
published in Foreign Affairs in the last 3 years. It's a totally different setup now.
I think
extremely complicated and precarious.
I think the notion that the Kurds helped Americans, to capture al-Baghdadi is disputed. Baghdadi was captured in Idlib, and it's questionable how the YPG has provided intelligence to the United States when YPG has nothing to do with Idlib area. So,
well, according to U.S. military intelligence and the briefings, the SDF intelligence actually was so impressive that they actually got DNA from al-Baghdadi well in advance of the operation. So that is something we can talk about in further detail, but it's pretty ancillary to the main agenda here today. I mean, you've got a situation where Turkey now, having accomplished the majority of what it desired to with this military operation, now, after the Pence visit, essentially is now unhappy again because not all the Kurdish forces have basically
withdrawn from the area.
Right.
Okay, Ali. President Trump, in his comments moments ago, he said the Kurds seem happy. Are they?
It depends how you define Kurds. Okay, and I disagree with the notion that we use Kurds to imply the YPG and SDF. So we need to pinpoint what we are talking about. We're talking about the YPG or SDF. Are they happy? I don't think they're happy because there's a feeling among the YPG upper echelon that they had been sold out. That's how they think. But the fact that there is still YPG presence along the Syria-Turkish border, which is creating a problem for Turkey.
Jeffrey, Ali actually touched upon an interesting point in that we should actually make an important distinction between Kurds and the YPG. Every time you open up a newspaper here in the United States or pretty much in Western media, it's always along the narrative that, Turkey is attacking the Kurds. Is this a deliberate narrative, or is it sort of a lack of understanding of the dynamics and on the ground, or the complexity of the issue?
It's partly a lack of understanding, partly the complexity, and partly a sense that at least the interests of the Kurdish people and the military leadership of the YPG SDF have similar interests. And essentially, with regard to their understanding that the U.S. had guaranteed them and promised them protection going forward. So,
but I'm sorry, but
my colleague is correct to say
let me
that
ask you a
Trump
question.
changed this on a dime. And in a way, and this is where you're getting this vehemence from Capitol Hill, is that the U.S., Donald Trump, betrayed the Kurds / the fighting force, the military leadership. Look, the rotten tomatoes and potatoes that have been thrown at all these forces is just one sign of that, what in essence, I use the same word, betrayal.
Okay, let me ask you this question because I have to follow up with this. What position of authority does the United States have in terms of guaranteeing a non-state actor like the YPG security in a place where they're not invited, they're not involved, and they share no border?
Sure. Well, at the very start of this conflict, Turkey had the same status. That changed later as interests aligned more with the Syrian regime. And the Russians, sure, they've been invited, but look at the human rights atrocities from all the intentional bombing of hospitals and civilians.
You're talking about the Assad regime.
I'm talking about the Russian assistance to the Assad regime.
In Idlib.
So, and not just in Idlib, a whole series of cities, a few of which have been leveled. And you've got a situation that is, I mean, we've been doing this for years. And right now, we've now got the prospect of ISIS reemerging. We've got Russians and Syrian forces in part of Syria where they haven't been before. Kurds not fully away, Turkish forces now in. and British, French, and American forces in various spots that, in essence, are different from what these governments are describing. So we've got, in addition to everything else that's difficult to manage here, another situation like, remember, the Russian forces of the Wagner Group, the mercenary force that went after the oil near Deir ez-Zor, and that led to the first U.S.-Russian exchange, military battle, if you will, that went decisively, obviously, in the favor of the American forces at that time. So we're looking at a situation where even Turkey now needs the U.S. to be a partner with regard to where these forces are, and yet the biggest thing necessary to get this relationship going again is, first, Turkey makes a basic commitment to keeping ISIS at bay and the prisoners locked up. And then you can go from there.
And President Trump has sort of touched upon that, saying that they've done a good job. Turkey's captured more than 100 Daesh or ISIS fighters in all this. All right, let's switch gears a little bit because we have about 10 minutes left in our show. President Trump, the businessman that he is, he said that he talked about some trade deals. But before that, he also said that they would be discussing Turkey's acquisition of the Russian-made S-400 missile defense system. We all know that subsequently led to the suspension of Turkey from the F-35 fighter jet program. Do any of you expect any progress on this front on this two-day official visit?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, Trump is a businessman and he wants to make profit, okay? And he wants to sell the jets to Turkey. I have written this extensively elsewhere that he cares about selling the weapons, selling the jet fighters to Turkey, and he is not really interested in whether or not they are compatible with S-400s or F-35s. What I believe is, he said to Mr. Erdogan today that wait for me to get reelected in 2020, and this problem will be resolved once and for all. This is what I believe.
Ali actually said Trump really doesn't care if they're incompatible with the Russian-made system, but I would
people around him do.
I would assume that there are many circles within the sort of the national security apparatus that would strongly disagree.
Absolutely. I mean, I have fond memories of working with my Turkish counterparts at NATO headquarters on numerous occasions. This is an alliance. And in essence, it needs to stand together. Now, there is no option in the North Atlantic Treaty for kicking out a member, but there's a lot of talk about this all throughout the West, in Europe, in the U.S., and other places.
Let me ask you then, how important of a member is Turkey in the alliance right now?
It's extremely important. That's why the Secretary General has been crystal clear about this. And that's why we're looking for the Turkish ally to align not with Russian interests, but with the alliance interest. And that starts with Daesh. It goes through the Kurdish forces as well, and eventually on to the regime. All of this is still on the table, unresolved, and we've had envoys quit because it's been so intractable over time.
Ali?
I totally agree. Turkey is an indispensable NATO ally, but here's the question. Has NATO done enough to appease Turkey's security concerns emanating from Syria? So this is the real question. Well, because Turkey has felt betrayed by NATO, Turkey has turned to Russia. It's pretty simple, and the policymakers in Washington need to understand this dynamic.
Okay, so there was a dynamic between the S-400 and the F-35, but one thing that we haven't brought up is the possible reintroduction of Turkey purchasing the Patriot missile defense system. We know that there was a second letter written by the White House addressed to Turkish officials. We aren't able to confirm it, but there was a roadmap laid out to the Turkish side saying, all right, here's how you avoid sanctions because of the acquisition of the S-400. Here's how you get back on track on the F-35. And there is a possible opening in the doorway of Turkey purchasing the Patriot missile defense system. Therefore, it can actually address its own national security. Is this a possible scenario? I mean, what I'm asking is, how can a country, after paying hundreds or billions of dollars, saying this is a done deal, all of a sudden say, all right, maybe get convinced by Washington, okay, we're not going to activate this and we're going to go back to
I don't think Turkey is ever going to give up on S-400s because comparing between the S-400s and Patriots, S-400s are more developed, more advanced weapon system compared to the Patriots. I think what's going to happen is Turkey has proposed a joint commission between the American officials and Turkish officials to supervise the interaction between S-400 and Patriots or F-35s. I think this is what's going to happen after today's meeting, that there's going to be a joint commission to supervise the interaction between the two missile systems that people in Washington, the Pentagon, believe incompatible.
Okay, is Congress going to be on board with this?
Not at all. Primarily because there were many, many discussions over months and years prior to the actual purchase. All kinds of shared discussions that were largely on the same page at the start and then gradually diverged. Remember, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter.
In 2015, yes.
At the outset of this. That was more consistent with alliance dynamics and shared interests. The fact that, I mean, this is all about NATO as well. It's not just about Washington, Ankara. And so you've got a commitment. If you're going to be a good ally, then you've got to stay within the agreements, everything from the treaty to all the ministerials to interests. And this diverges from that. It's the interests of NATO as an entire alliance that Turkey is not safeguarding here. And that's why this roadmap is important. And possibly, I wouldn't say even 50%, but I would say about 35% Turkey may actually take this offer, grab some Patriots, and diminish the S-400 operationally.
Okay, I want to follow up with something that Ali actually also, a point that he made a little bit earlier, with that when you said that, you know, for months prior to the purchase of the S-400, the United States had actually was in discussions with Turkey. But you talked about the spirit of the alliance, but for many years, Turkey did voice its concerns. We did see, since the end of Gulf War II, sort of Turkey saying, you know, there are attacks coming from that side of the border, whether it's in Iraq, and the United States as well as other European countries sort of temporarily based their Patriots there, but then they pulled it out. But this was a continuing national security concern for Turkey. So obviously, the alliance really didn't take that seriously, and this actually led to Turkey pursuing other alternatives. Is that correct?
What tarnished the NATO image in Turkey is actually in 2018, at the height of the Syrian civil war, Germans withdrew the Patriot missiles from Turkey. So Turkey was exposed to the threats coming from Syria, and what would you do? You would try to acquire other means of defense, which is S-400 in this regard.
Well, no, that's in my view, one of those does not logically lead to the other.
Well, it's good that we're having discussion.
Especially among friends, when the interests were quite clear. And there was no ambiguity about what the expectations of Brussels and Washington were in this regard. And Article 5, the attack against one, attack against all, is very specific about the nature of the attack. It's not small level kind of, say, a single car suicide bomb. It refers to...
But there have been hundreds of Katyusha rockets that have been sort of fired from northern Syria.
Okay, yeah. And obviously, Turkey has a point in this regard that I think is a legitimate one. And what we thought we understood was, especially with regard to the closeness of the Turkish and U.S. military staffs, that if we just left these two leaders that are having lunch right now out of it, we would have solved the situation. In fact, the joint patrols that were happening were in Turkey's interest and the alliance's interest. They were working. They were effective. But
no.
you also had...
You disagree, Ali?
I disagree.
Well, let me finish.
Okay.
You also had over 10,000 ISIS prisoners fully bottled up. And if we go back to where negotiations were domestically inside Turkey with Kurdish political representatives and Erdogan some time ago, they were actually making some progress. A whole variety of other factors changed, and that caused basically regime thinking to change, Erdogan's thinking to change, his advisors, and now we're in an entirely different place. But there was an opportunity some time ago where it wasn't going to actually lead to, especially these human rights abuses of the FSA forces, there must be a gesture now from President Erdogan because of what has happened. This cannot go on, and that's what Congress is most exercised about. And there actually is a shared interest here on this point.
Jeffrey, I don't have a lot of time. I want to give you the last word because Jeffrey was saying that these joint patrols were working, and then I saw that you nodding your head.
To say, what was the purpose of joint patrols in the beginning? To make sure that the YPG forces were away from the Turkish-Syria border. They were not. The patrols were purely symbolic. The YPG forces hadn't withdrawn from the Turkish-Syrian border.
Nor were they attacking.
So it doesn't matter. The purpose was to make sure that there was no YPG presence within the proposed safe zone, which wasn't the case. So the joint patrols failed, in my opinion.
I think they were working. Turkey's interests were essentially secure because attacks were not taking place.
All right, gentlemen, Jeffrey Stacey, former U.S. State Department official, and Ali Demirdas, good to have you on the show. Thank you for your analysis, your insight. I really do appreciate the lively discussion. All right.